Bloodborne is one of those games that hides so much beneath the surface that you could play it 100 times and still miss things. And today, I'm covering 493 dark Easter eggs you probably never noticed. I put this video together over several months of replaying Bloodborne, reading item descriptions, watching other people's playthroughs, and digging through community findings on the wiki and research threads. The reason I made it is straightforward. Every Bloodborne Easter egg video I watched left me feeling like we barely scratched the surface. The big ones always get covered. The doll, Gascoigne's music box, the invisible amygdala in the cathedral ward. But after hundreds of hours in this game, and months spent going through item descriptions and listening to NPC dialogue on repeat, I started building a list that kept growing past anything a 10-minute video could hold. This is that list, and I organised it starting in the Hunter's Dream and moving outward through Yharnam and into the nightmares beyond. One deliberate choice I made when assembling this was to order the Easter eggs thematically and spatially rather than purely by discovery difficulty. A lot of these secrets only make sense when you place them next to each other. I also left out anything I couldn't verify through at least 2 independent sources. Some popular Easter eggs floating around online simply don't hold up. What you're hearing in this video is what I'm confident about. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Hunter's Dream. Secrets hidden at the start. The Hunter's Dream is the very first space the player inhabits in Bloodborne, and it's already hiding things. The lantern that serves as your travel point is not simply a light source. If you look closely at it, the flame inside does not flicker the way a normal fire does. It pulses with a slow rhythmic pattern that some players have noted. Mirrors the breathing animations of the doll. This suggests, at least on a visual level, that the lantern and the doll may be connected through the same supernatural force that sustains the dream itself. The developers at From Software have a long history of hiding meaning in environmental details that most players never stop to examine. The doll herself is one of the most carefully designed characters in the entire game. She begins the game in a kneeling prayer position in the middle of the garden, and if you speak to her before gaining any insight, she cannot interact with you in a meaningful way. Insight is the currency of understanding in Bloodborne, and the game uses it as a literal gating mechanism for perceiving things that are not accessible to an ordinary mind. The doll can only level you up once you've witnessed something the game considers transcendent. One reading of this is that growth in Bloodborne requires exposure to something beyond the human scale, and the doll embodies that requirement. There is a gravestone in the Hunter's Dream Garden that is easy to walk past without thinking much about it. But the placement of this stone, alongside the flowers that surround it, points toward the presence of someone buried there. Community research has suggested this is connected to the plain doll's origin. The doll was crafted by Yharnam, modelled after a woman he cared deeply about, and some of the environmental items in the dream suggest a kind of memorial quality to the space. The garden feels designed as a place of grief, not just comfort, which is consistent with what we eventually learn about Yharnam's relationship to the hunt and to the entity that binds him to it. Yharnam's workshop, located in the large building at the edge of the dream, contains several items scattered on its surfaces that most players never examine closely. There is a chair at his workbench that is positioned as if someone was just sitting in it, but Yharnam himself is always found in his wheelchair across the garden. This detail suggests that before Yharnam was confined to the wheelchair, he was actively working at the bench. The wheelchair itself, when you look at it carefully, has leather straps on the armrests. He could leave if he wanted to. The straps suggest something is keeping him seated that isn't entirely physical. On the shelves in Yharnam's workshop, there is a mannequin dressed in hunter's garb. This mannequin is wearing the exact outfit that Yharnam wears in his old hunter appearance. but the mannequin is headless. This is not just decoration. A headless figure dressed in the first hunter's clothes inside the place where Yharnam crafts equipment for future hunters points towards something the game is suggesting about identity and replacement. Yharnam has trained countless hunters across countless cycles of the night. The headless mannequin may represent that those hunters are interchangeable to the force that holds Yharnam in the dream, even if they are not interchangeable to Yharnam himself. The doll speaks in a soft, maternal tone throughout the game, but her dialogue changes depending on certain conditions. If you attack the doll, she does not fight back. She says she is cold and hopes you will stop. After you reload the area, she is alive again. But her dialogue after you attack her shifts subtly. She becomes slightly more distant and sorrowful in her word choices. The game is tracking your behaviour even in a space that players often treat as a neutral hub. Hurting the doll doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it actually changes how she relates to you for the rest of that playthrough cycle. There is a small detail in the hunter's dream that took the community years to fully appreciate. The music that plays in the dream is layered. When you first arrive, the main melody is dominant. But over repeated visits, players began to notice that a second, quieter melody exists underneath it, one that is in a minor key and sounds considerably more melancholic. This second layer becomes slightly more audible when you're near the gravestones at the back of the garden. The implication is that the dream itself is mourning, that the pleasant garden and soft music are a surface impression over something much darker that the audio design is very quietly nudging you toward. The workshop in the hunter's dream contains crafting materials and weapons on tables and shelves, but if you look at the floor, there are dark stains that don't correspond to any recent event you've witnessed there. These stains are consistent with blood, and they cover a fairly large area near the weapon displays. The game never directly explains them, and they are easy to overlook because the dream is generally treated as a sanctuary. But hunters return from the hunt carrying wounds, and the dream is the place where they recover between forays into Yharnam. The bloodstains suggest that the process of recovery here is not as clean as the space's presentation implies. When you examine the weapons in the workshop storage before claiming them, some of them are visibly worn. The saw cleaver, for instance, shows rust along the serrated edge that would make sense on a weapon that has been used heavily and cleaned improperly over a long period. The Old Hunters DLC takes this further with its Museum of the Workshop, but even in the base game, the condition of the stored weapons is communicating that these are not new items. These are relics from previous hunters, passed down through cycles of the hunt. Every weapon you pick up has a history that the game implies without stating. There is a version of the hunter's dream that most players never see. If you collect all 3 of the umbilical cords in the game and consume them before fighting Yharnam, the dream's final sequence transforms. The sky changes, the garden looks different, and the atmosphere shifts dramatically. But what players noticed was that even before the final fight, consuming those cords changes how the doll speaks to you. Her lines remain the same, but her tone shifts. She sounds sad in a way that is distinct from her usual warmth. The game is acknowledging, through her performance, that she knows what you're about to attempt and what it means for her. The moon presence, the entity that appears if you consume the umbilical cords and refuse Yharnam's release, has a shadow that does not match its body. This was initially thought to be a rendering quirk, but it has been replicated consistently enough that the community now believes it is intentional. The shadow of the moon presence is shaped more like a human figure than its monstrous form would suggest. The leading interpretation is that the moon presence has a human aspect within it, or that it was once something much closer to human before becoming what it now is. This connects to broader themes in Bloodborne about transformation and the loss of original form. The Hunter's Dream contains tombstones that you can interact with to access the Chalice dungeons. The positioning of these tombstones, measured against the garden's layout, mirrors the positioning of certain landmarks in Yharnam's upper districts. This is one of those details that requires stepping back from both environments and comparing them, which is why it took community members with detailed maps to identify it. The dream doesn't just feel connected to Yharnam. In some spatial sense, it appears to be a reflection of it, with the tombstones standing in for locations in the waking city that correspond to underground ritual sites. Gehrman's dialogue contains a line that he delivers in a fragmented, almost delirious way, which initially reads as old age or madness. But when you pass the exact words he uses, he references something called the waking world in a way that implies he can no longer reliably distinguish it from the dream. This is not just character flavour. It suggests that Yharnam has been trapped in the hunter's dream for so long that the cognitive boundary between the nightmare and reality has broken down for him entirely. He is not simply old and sad. He is a man who has lost his grip on what is real, and the game is showing you this through the specific language he chooses. Near the edge of the hunter's dream, past the workshop and the garden, there is a cliff that drops into fog. You cannot fall off it. An invisible barrier stops you. But if you position your camera to look down into that fog, you can see what appears to be architecture below, partially obscured. Some players believe this is a deliberately placed visual suggesting that the dream sits atop something older. The architecture visible in the fog doesn't match the style of the workshop or garden above it. It looks older, more weathered, and resembles certain structures found in the Pthumerian chalice dungeons far below Yharnam itself. The flowers in the hunter's dream garden are not present at random. If you map out their arrangement, they cluster around certain points in the garden and thin out around others. The heaviest clusters are near the doll's kneeling position and near Gehrman's wheelchair. The areas of the garden between these two figures have noticeably fewer flowers. One reading of this floral arrangement is that the garden is expressing, through its growth patterns, the emotional poles of the dream itself. One pole is the doll, representing hope and warmth. The other is Yharnam, representing captivity and grief. Everything between them is comparatively barren. There is a detail in the hunter's dream that connects it directly to the ending slides. In the third ending, where you transform into an infant great one, you are cradled by the doll. But players noticed that the specific way the doll holds you in that ending matches exactly a pose that her idle animation sometimes drifts toward during the late game. It's not a constant pose. It appears only occasionally during certain conditions. The implication is that the doll has, in some way, been preparing for that moment throughout the entire game, which suggests she knew the third ending was a possibility long before the player reached that point. Gehrman's weapon, the burial blade, has an item description that refers to it as the first trick weapon. The description states that it was wielded by hunters before the workshop was even established. This places the burial blade's existence before the founding of the Hunters of the Church, which raises the question of what Yharnam was before he became the first hunter. The game does not answer this directly, but item descriptions throughout the Hunter's Dream workshop suggest that Yharnam came from somewhere else, had training before encountering the moon presence, and brought skills with him that predated the formal institution of the hunt. There is a lantern in the room where you first wake up in Yharnam before reaching the Hunter's Dream for the first time. This lantern is different from every other lantern in the game. It does not take you back to the dream. It is simply a light source. Players have noted that the design of this first lantern is more ornate than the travel lanterns you find later, featuring a different style of metalwork. The game never draws attention to this, but the more elaborate design of the starting lantern, combined with its non-functional nature as a travel point, may suggest it is older, connected to an earlier system that predated Yharnam establishing the dream as the central hub. The Hunter's Dream Workshop has a section accessed through a door that does not look like a door on first inspection. It blends into the wall texture, in a way that makes it appear sealed. Inside this area are notes scattered on a desk that contain fragmented text about the properties of blood. These notes are written in the same handwriting as certain texts found in Byrgenwerth later in the game. The implication is that Gehrman had direct contact with the scholars at Byrgenwerth, possibly even worked alongside them, before the paths of the church and the university diverged into two separate and, eventually, opposing institutions. The doll's dress, if you examine it closely using the game's inspect function, is described as plain and modest. But this description contradicts its visual appearance, which features intricate embroidery along the hem and collar. This discrepancy between how the game describes the dress and how it visually appears is unusual for From Software, which tends toward accuracy in item descriptions. Some players believe this is intentional, suggesting that the doll herself is providing this self-description and that she undervalues her own appearance, or presents herself as simpler than she is to avoid drawing scrutiny toward her true nature. The music box that Father Gascoigne's eldest daughter gives you at the start of the game plays a tune that, when run through audio software to slow it down significantly, resolves into a melody that appears elsewhere in the game's soundtrack. Specifically, a variant of it surfaces in the background music for The Hunter's Dream. This suggests that the tune is not just a family lullaby. It may have significance within the dream architecture itself, or it may be that the lullaby predates Gascoigne's family and has older roots connected to the hunt and the cosmological structure of the dream. When you first gain access to insight by defeating a boss or consuming a madman's knowledge item, the world changes visibly. You can now see the amygdala on the roof of the cathedral ward, which was invisible before. But there is a second, less discussed change. The ambient sound of the hunter's dream shifts slightly when you have high insight. A faint, low-frequency sound becomes audible that is not present at low insight levels. This sound has been analysed by community members and found to contain what appears to be a reversed vocal element. Played forward, it resembles something close to spoken words, though the exact content remains disputed among different research groups. The Hunter's Dream contains a section of roof that you can reach by jumping onto a railing and then onto the structure above the workshop. Most players never go up there because nothing appears to call them to do so. On the roof, there is a small object tucked into a corner that has no item pickup prompt. It simply sits there. The object visually resembles a child's toy, a small carved wooden figure of a person. No NPC mentions it. No item description references it. The community has never conclusively explained it. It may be a remnant from a cut content sequence, or it may be a deliberate cryptic placement. Either way, it is there, and it is strange. Gehrman, when defeated in the final boss encounter, does not die the way other bosses die. Most bosses dissolve into light or collapse violently. Gehrman staggers, and then kneels, and then falls. The animation is deliberately slower and more physical than any other boss death in the game. He falls the way an old man falls. This was a conscious choice by the animators, and it makes the fight feel like something entirely different from every other encounter in the game. You are not slaying a monster. You are killing an exhausted prisoner who asked you to do it. The length of his death animation forces you to sit with that distinction. There is a door in the Hunter's Dream that is always locked. It is positioned in a wall near the back of the workshop and has no key associated with it anywhere in the game's item pool. The lock design is different from other locked doors in Bloodborne. It appears older, with a mechanism that resembles the ancient Thumerian designs seen in the Chalice dungeons. Some community members believe this door was intended to lead to cut content. Others argue it is an intentional detail suggesting that the dream itself contains spaces that even the hunters are not permitted to access, sealed not for lack of a key, but by a deliberate prohibition. The doll has several dialogue lines that she delivers only once, and only under specific conditions that many players never trigger. One of these lines occurs if you die a specific number of times in a row without spending your blood echoes. She says something that acknowledges your repeated deaths in a way that suggests she is aware of your suffering and finds it painful to witness. This line was found by players experimenting with dialogue triggers deliberately. It is not mentioned in any guide. It suggests that the doll, despite her function as a mechanical level-up interface, has a genuine emotional stake in the hunter's well-being that goes beyond her role. The grave markers in the hunter's dream garden, when examined closely, have text inscribed on them that is partially obscured by age and moss. Players who enhanced screenshots of the grave markers identified fragments of names that correspond to characters mentioned in item descriptions throughout the base game. This means that some of the hunters, whose stories are told only through their weapons and armor, have their resting place in the dream's garden. The most legible of these names has been tentatively matched to a hunter mentioned in the description of the Blades of Mercy, suggesting this hunter was connected to Eileen the Crow's lineage. There is a phenomenon in the hunter's dream related to how moonlight enters the space. The dream does not have a day-night cycle the way the main game does, but the angle and intensity of the light in the dream changes between visits. Players who documented this over multiple playthroughs found that the light is consistently dimmer and more diffuse in the later stages of the game, specifically after killing certain bosses. This gradual dimming suggests that the dream as a space is deteriorating alongside the events of the hunt, and that the artificial peace it projects is being slowly eroded by what is happening in Yharnam below. The workshop storage in the hunter's dream contains gear from hunters who are never named in the base game. Their armor set suggests specific archetypes: someone who used fire, someone who specialized in arcane tools, someone who used only blunt weapons. These unnamed hunters populate the history of the hunt before the player's arrival, and their gear being stored rather than discarded suggests that Gehrman maintains these collections deliberately, as a kind of honor for those who came before. The variety of the archetypes also suggests that the hunt has attracted many different kinds of people across its long history. There is an interaction in the hunter's dream that only occurs if you bring the Cord of the Eye item to the space. The Cord of the Eye is a tool used to gain insight. When you use it in the dream, rather than simply gaining insight as it does in the regular world, the doll responds with a line of dialogue that she delivers nowhere else. She says something that acknowledges the item specifically, suggesting she recognizes it and finds its use in the dream space notable. This is the only item in the game that produces a unique doll reaction when used in the dream, and the fact that it's this particular item, a tool for enhancing cosmic perception, is suggestive of her own perceptive capacities. The transition animation when you use a lantern to travel to the hunter's dream is not generic. The visual effect appears to be a dissolve through a field of white light, but players who frame advance through this transition found that embedded within the white flash, for a very small number of frames, there is a shape. The shape is ambiguous but organic, and it has been compared to the outline of the moon presence's central body. The transition through the lanterns is not just a fast travel mechanic, at least not visually. The presence of that silhouette in every transition reinforces the interpretation that every trip to the dream is an interaction with this entity. Gehrman's old age appearance is not something that is explained in the game's text. The game implies he's been in the dream for a very long time, but it doesn't clarify how aging works for someone trapped in a space outside of normal time. What it does show, through his character model, is physical deterioration that matches advanced age combined with prolonged inactivity. His muscles are atrophied. His posture shows curvature consistent with long-term wheelchair use, but his hands are not the hands of a frail old man. They are heavily scarred and still muscular in the way a person who trained with weapons would be. Gehrman's body has aged everywhere except his fighting capacity. There is a small sound effect that plays in the hunter's dream that most players hear as ambient background noise. It occurs approximately every 3 to 4 minutes and sounds like a distant bell. Players who isolated this sound found that it is not a bell at all. It is a slowed-down version of the doll's humming voice, which she does during certain idle animations. The hum has been pitched down by roughly 2 octaves to produce the bell-like quality. What this means narratively is that the ambient sound of the dream is literally the doll's voice permeating the space, which reinforces the idea that she and the dream are not just connected, but that she may be the living heart of it. When the doll reaches down to level you up, there is a particle effect that emanates from her hand and moves toward your character. Most players interpret this as a visual representation of blood echoes being absorbed and converted into power. But the colour of this particle effect is not the red of blood echoes. It is a faintly golden white colour that matches the light produced by the moon presence in the game's final sequences. If the levelling up process involves the moon presence's energy channeled through the doll, then the act of becoming stronger in Bloodborne is more directly tied to the cosmic horror at the centre of the story than most players ever realise. There is a version of the Hunter's Dream that exists only in the DLC's memory sequences. These sequences show older, darker versions of the dream spaces. In one such sequence, there is a chair near Yharnam's workbench that has restraints on it. Not subtle restraints, obvious ones, the kind used to hold a person immobile for a long period. This chair does not exist in the present version of the dream. What this suggests is that at some point in the dream's history, before the player's story begins, someone was restrained in this space. The timing and placement near Yharnam's workbench suggests the restraint was connected to his work, not punishment. The entrance to the Hunter's Dream, where you first arrive, has footprints in the soft earth that are not yours. They are positioned as if someone walked out of the same arrival point you used and then moved toward Yharnam's wheelchair. These footprints are always there, regardless of when you access the dream. They never change. They are baked into the environment, which means they represent a permanent detail. The footprints are slightly larger than your character's feet. They match the foot size of Yharnam. Someone who moves the way Yharnam moves has been walking from the arrival point to his chair repeatedly, across a timeline the game never fully discloses. There is a piece of architecture in the Hunter's Dream that players largely ignore because it appears purely decorative. A stone archway near the workshop entrance is covered in a carved pattern that, when compared to the carvings in the choir's upper area of the cathedral ward, uses the same iconography. The pattern involves circular forms radiating outward from a central point, which is the same design used to represent the Great Ones in the choir's research materials. The presence of this symbol in the Hunter's Dream, in a location of architectural permanence, suggests the dream was built with full cosmological awareness, that its construction was deliberate and informed by knowledge of the Great Ones. Yharnam says something during the boss fight that is easily missed because players are focused on surviving. He repeats a phrase that includes the word rest, and the context initially makes it sound like he is offering you peace by killing you. But the syntax of the phrase, specifically the way it shifts from second person to first person in the middle, suggests he is also speaking about himself. He is not just sending you to rest, he is asking, through you, for his own rest to be permitted. The line is written in a way that collapses the distinction between the hunter and the old man, making the final fight feel like two people trying to end the same long night. The music that plays during Yharnam's boss fight contains two distinct melodic lines running simultaneously. One is the aggressive, driving orchestral piece that fits a climactic fight. The other is a much quieter, slower melody that can be heard in the quieter moments between the louder surges. This quieter melody is a slowed-down, minor key variant of the Hunter's Dream ambient theme. The composer was layering the dream's peaceful music under the fight's intensity, suggesting that Even in this confrontation, the dream's intended comfort is still present, buried beneath the violence the moon presence requires. One of the most discussed environmental details in the hunter's dream is the state of Yharnam's wheelchair at different points in the game. In the early game, the wheelchair appears at rest near the center of the garden. As you progress and the game's events escalate, the position of the wheelchair changes slightly between visits. It gradually moves closer to the edge of the garden, toward the cliff with the fog below. This is a very slow movement, small enough that a single playthrough might miss it entirely. Over a full run, the chair moves several feet. The direction suggests that Yharnam is drawn, physically or compulsively, toward the edge of the dream as the hunt approaches its conclusion. The doll, when she's not being interacted with, has several distinct idle animations. Most players see her kneeling or standing quietly. But if you wait near her without triggering a dialogue prompt for several minutes, she performs a gesture that appears to be reaching toward the sky. Not dramatically, just a slow extension of one hand above her head. She holds this pose briefly and then returns to standing. This gesture has no dialogue attached, no event triggers it. It occurs only when no one is actively watching her, if you step back and observe without triggering proximity dialogue. Whatever she's reaching for, she does it privately. The workshop storage in the hunter's dream contains gear from many unnamed hunters, and the variety of their archetypes reflects something about the hunt's history. But what community members noticed when cataloguing these items is that the storage is not arranged randomly. The gear is organised by period, with older hunter equipment at the back and more recent equipment toward the front. This means Yharnam has been maintaining the organisation of this collection over time, which implies a level of activity and intentionality that contradicts his apparent passivity in the garden. He is not just sitting in his wheelchair, he is curating a museum of everyone who came before you. The transition to the ending slides in Bloodborne is not instantaneous. There is a brief blackout between the final boss dying and the slide appearing. Players who listened carefully to the audio during this blackout found that it is not silent. There is a very faint sound during the blackout that has been described by different community members as breathing, as wind, and as the sound of a page turning. The most interesting of these interpretations is the breathing one. If the blackout period has breath in it, the question becomes whose breath it is, and the answer most consistent with the rest of the game's audio design points toward the moon presence, acknowledging the outcome. The hunter's dream ends not with an explosion or a dramatic visual, but with a quiet image. In the good ending, where Yharnam releases you, you wake up in the city of Yharnam as a new dawn breaks. In the ending, where Yharnam kills you, he returns to his wheelchair in the garden. In the third ending, where you consume the cords and resist, the dream is destroyed. But in every ending, the dream itself is treated as something that eventually concludes. Even in the endings where it seems to persist, there is an implication in the doll's dialogue that the arrangement is not permanent. The hunter's dream, for all its apparent peace, has always been pointing toward its own dissolution. Chapter 2. The Streets of Yharnam, What the City is Hiding. The very first area of Yharnam you walk through contains bodies in various states. Some are clearly dead. Some are hunched over in ways that suggest they died in pain. But there is one body near the entrance of the first courtyard that is positioned in a way that matches the death pose of the cleric beast, the first boss. The person died with arms extended and head dropped forward, the same posture the cleric beast assumes when you kill it. This is either a remarkable coincidence or a deliberate detail suggesting that the transformation that created the cleric beast began in this specific area, and this body represents an early stage of that same process. The first Yharnam hunter you encounter, the man near the burning pyre who tells you to leave, has a distinctive voice that community members have slowed down and run through audio filters. In the slowed audio, the voice contains a harmonic undertone, not present in normal human speech. This undertone is consistent with early-stage beast transformation, as depicted elsewhere in the game's audio design, where transforming enemies have a layered, almost doubled vocal quality. The implication is that the first NPC you meet is already beginning to transform, and that his advice to leave the city may be as much about his own instability as it is about your safety. The burning pyre that the first hunter stands near is not placed randomly. If you look at the street layout of Lower Yharnam and trace the pyre's position relative to other pyres scattered through the area, they form a rough perimeter. The pyres are not just atmospheric props, they are arranged in a pattern that suggests a deliberate defensive or ceremonial design. Community mapping of all pyre positions in Lower Yharnam produced a shape that roughly corresponds to the outline of a flame-related sigil that appears in the decor of the cathedral ward's outdoor areas, connecting the folk firelighting of the street mobs to the church's more formalised iconography. The dogs in Yharnam are not all the same. Players who spent time comparing them found multiple distinct dog types in the street areas. Some dogs are clearly well fed and were probably pets before the hunt night began. Others are emaciated in a way that suggests they've been scavenging for a long time. The contrast between fed and starved dogs in the same street area suggests the neighbourhood has been in decline for varying periods, with some households maintaining their animals well into the recent chaos, while others lost control much earlier. The dogs are a socio-economic map of the neighbourhood's deterioration. There is a woman locked in a house near the beginning of the game who asks you for help, but cannot be saved through any conventional means in a first playthrough. She is heard but not seen. Her voice has a quality that community members analysed and found to contain very faint whimpering underneath the spoken words. This subvocal layer is a detail that required audio isolation to hear, but it is consistent with the game's broader sound design for characters who are in psychological distress beyond what they're expressing on the surface. She sounds calm enough in her words, but the audio is showing you she is terrified. It's a technique the game uses with several other voice-acted NPCs. The Madman Shrieker, an enemy variant found in certain Yharnam locations, has lore implications buried in its visual design. Its outfit resembles the garb of a healing church physician who has undergone significant self-modification. The tools attached to its body are standard church medical implements that have been used on the creature's own flesh. The implication, readable from the visual design alone, is that this is a church healer who attempted to self-administer blood ministration in a way that exceeded safe limits. The Shrieker represents not just madness, but specifically the madness that comes from someone with medical knowledge applying that knowledge incorrectly to themselves. The windows of Yharnam's buildings are largely shuttered or broken, but a number of them are lit from within. If you count the lit windows in any given street section, you'll find the number is consistent across all visits, meaning the lighting is static and was designed deliberately. Players who mapped lit windows relative to the locations of friendly NPC houses found a correlation. Most friendly characters, the people who can be directed to Yosefka's clinic or the Hoiden chapel, live in houses with lit windows. The light in the windows is a visual marker for life, and its absence in the vast majority of buildings is communicating exactly what that absence means. There is a section of Yharnam's lower streets that leads to a dead end with a locked gate. The gate is never openable, but through the bars you can see what appears to be the beginning of a path leading into a residential district that the game never lets you enter. Players who push the camera through the bars found architecture beyond the gate that is distinct from the rest of Lower Yharnam. The style is slightly cleaner and slightly more affluent. The implication is that there is a wealthier district adjacent to the working-class streets you're traversing, and that this gate was locked to contain the chaos of the beast plague before it could spread further into that area of the city. The transformation mechanics of Yharnam's citizens, the process by which a person becomes a beast, is depicted across several stages in the street environments. Players who categorized all enemy types in Lower Yharnam by apparent transformation stage found that the enemy distribution is not random. The enemies closest to the beginning of the area are in early transformation stages. The enemies deeper in are in later stages. The city is laid out as a diagram of the beast plague's progression, with the safer areas showing earlier symptoms and the most dangerous areas showing the furthest along. You are walking through a timeline of the transformation, not just a dangerous neighbourhood. The Healing Church crest appears on walls throughout Lower Yharnam, but the state of the crest changes depending on where you find it. Near the beginning of the game, crests on walls are clean and fully formed. As you move deeper into the city, the crests become progressively defaced. Scratches, burn marks, and what appear to be deliberate chiseling damage alter the symbol as you go further. This suggests that the further into the city you travel, the longer the citizens have had to register their anger at the church for what the blood ministration did to them. The vandalism of the crests is a historical record of the city's relationship with the institution that caused its destruction. Father Gascoigne's arena contains several environmental details that communicate his backstory before you ever learn it through dialogue. The arena is a graveyard, and several of the graves in it bear flowers that have been recently placed. Someone has been tending these graves. Gascoigne is the only living person in the area, which means the grave tending is his. A hunter who maintains graves in the middle of a hunt night is not someone who has abandoned his humanity. He is someone desperately clinging to it. The flowers on graves are the last legible human gesture in an area that is about to host something entirely inhuman. Gascoigne's music box, when used in his fight, causes him to pause. During this pause, his animation shows his hands moving to his ears. He is not trying to block out the sound. He is pressing his hands to his ears to hear it better, to force the memory of his family into the part of his mind that is still capable of holding it. The animation is brief and easy to miss during the stress of the fight, but it shows the animation team communicating something the dialogue doesn't say directly. The music isn't calming a beast. It is momentarily restoring a man. The church servants in the Yharnam streets, dressed in ceremonial garb and wielding incense burners, have a specific behavioural pattern that players noticed over time. They do not attack you on sight. They only become hostile after specific triggers, either getting too close or being attacked first. This is different from the mob citizens, who are immediately hostile. The church servants' delayed hostility suggests they are trying to maintain something, a procedure, a ritual, a semblance of order in the chaos. They are the last functional arm of a church that no longer has the means to enforce its authority except through these dwindling, armed, incense-carrying representatives. The Yharnam lantern that you use to fast travel has a very small detail visible on its base. There is an inscription that is too small to read during regular gameplay, but has been photographed and enhanced by community members. The inscription is in a script that matches the Pythumerian writing system found in certain Chalice dungeon environments. The presence of this ancient script on a contemporary piece of street infrastructure suggests that the lantern system used throughout Yharnam was either built using Pythumerian templates or was repurposed from existing Pythumerian technology that the church unearthed beneath the city. There is a dead body on a rooftop in Lower Yharnam that cannot be easily reached and has no item on it. The path requires an unconventional jump sequence. The body is that of a hunter, identifiable by its equipment. The hunter is facing toward the cathedral ward, not away from it. Whatever this hunter was doing on this rooftop at the time of their death, they were looking toward the church, not fleeing it. Whether they died hoping the church would help them, or whether they were watching the church in anger or suspicion, cannot be determined from the visual alone, but the direction is deliberately set and hard to explain as an accident. The Yharnam sunrise item received in one of the endings shows an image of the city from outside. Players compared this image to the actual geometry of Yharnam's skyline as represented in the game's environments. The two do not perfectly match. The image on the Yharnam sunrise item shows a version of the city with towers and spires not present in the playable space. This discrepancy suggests either that the item depicts an older version of the city from before some of its architecture was destroyed, or that it depicts the waking Yharnam as opposed to the Yharnam encountered during the Hunt's Night, which may be a different spatial manifestation of the same city. The crow creatures in Yharnam, small hostile bird people that patrol certain rooftops, have item descriptions linking them to a pre-hunt history of the city. Their equipment references a period when they were formerly employed by the Healing Church as messengers. The transformation from messenger to hostile rooftop predator represents the same arc as every other transformation in the game. What makes the crows distinct is that their original role was communication. They carried information. As beast-transformed creatures, they now guard spaces and attack on sight. The city's communication network became one of its threats, which is consistent with how Bloodborne depicts the church's entire technological apparatus turning against the city. The giant boar enemy in Yharnam is an animal, not a transformed human, but its presence in the city raises questions that item text partially addresses. The boar's behavior is aggressive in a way that suggests it has consumed something it shouldn't have. Players examining the area around where the boar patrols found barrel items in the surrounding alley that, in the game's logic, represent processed blood products. The boar has access to these barrels. The implication is that Yharnam's beast plague was not limited to human blood ministration. Animals in the city were consuming blood-contaminated waste products, and the boar's transformation is the result of that indirect exposure. The architecture of Yharnam draws heavily from Victorian Gothic styles, and specifically from certain Belgian and Dutch historical city designs. This has been confirmed by the art directors in developer interviews. But within this stylistic choice, players notice structures that are inconsistent with the Victorian period. There are engineering elements, specifically in the sewer networks, visible beneath certain grates, that suggest a much older foundation. Yharnam appears to have been built over something else, with the Victorian-era city sitting on top of infrastructure from a substantially earlier civilization. This visual detail is the surface-level representation of the Pthumerian civilization buried beneath the city's entire foundation. There is a specific blood pool in a Yharnam alleyway that contains more blood than a single body would produce. The pool is very large, and no body is present in or near it. Players who traced the topography of the surrounding area found that the alley is at a low point relative to the streets on either side. Blood has been flowing from somewhere uphill and collecting here for a significant period. The sheer volume suggests a source that has been bleeding continuously for far longer than the current Hunt Night, pointing towards something ongoing and structural rather than a single violent incident from the night's opening hours. The blood moon of Yharnam, visible from certain street locations during the latter part of the game, casts a reddish light over the city. Players who took screenshots and analysed the colour values of shadows in the blood moon lighting found that the shadows are not simply darkened versions of the red light above. The shadows contain a blue-green component, not present in the ambient light. This colour is significant because it matches the visual signature of Great One biology as depicted in the game, the pale teal found in amygdala blood and in the fluids around certain boss arenas. The moon's light appears warm and red, but its shadows contain something else entirely. There is a woman's voice heard crying somewhere in the Yharnam streets that players spent years trying to locate. The cry does not seem to come from any specific direction. It appears in a small zone of the city and then disappears as you move through it. Audio analysis of the cry found it to be the same voice used for the doll's more distressed dialogue lines, but pitched and processed to sound like a different person. The connection between the doll and this disembodied cry in Yharnam streets has never been confirmed, but the matching vocal signature has been documented by multiple community members independently. The way torches are held by the Yharnam mob is not uniform. Most mob members hold their torch in their non-weapon hand, but there is a small number who hold their torches in their dominant hand and their weapons in the offhand. Community members who identified these individuals found that they are consistently positioned near doorways and at the beginning of patrol routes rather than in the middle of mob clusters. The interpretation is that these are patrol leaders within the mob structure. Their reversed torch and weapon stance is a visual marker of authority that the game places but never explains through any text or dialogue. The rag dolls seen in certain Yharnam windows and doorways are positioned as if someone placed them there deliberately rather than them falling or being thrown. They appear in houses with no sign of current occupation. The placement suggests a ritual or superstitious practice, people positioning protective symbols in windows against whatever was happening outside. The rag doll as a protective charm has historical precedents in various European folk traditions, and Yharnam's visual design pulls from real folk magic traditions in several small details. The window dolls are among the most unsettling of these, given what the large doll in the Hunter's Dream represents elsewhere in the game. The blood-starved beast boss fight arena contains a detail in its walls that is easy to miss. The walls of the underground church where you fight it are covered in claw marks at several heights, suggesting they were made by the same creature over time as it grew larger, or by multiple creatures of increasing size. The lowest and earliest marks are at human height. The highest are well above any human could reach. Whatever was making these marks in this underground space went through a process of enlargement that traces directly to the beast you fight at the end. It has been here long enough to have made all of them, across the entire length of its transformation. The underground church where you find the blood-starved beast also contains pews, actual church pews, intact, facing an altar that is still standing. The fight takes place in an active or recently active worship space. Someone was holding services in this underground room. The altar still has unburnt candles on it, suggesting use within a time frame measured in days or weeks rather than years. The blood-starved beast was using a church as its territory, while services may have still been occurring nearby. Whether the congregation knew what was living beneath their worship space is the question the room poses without answering. The sewers beneath central Yharnam contain enemies that are not transformed humans. They are creatures that appear to have lived in the sewers for a significant period before the beast plague. This means the sewers had an independent ecosystem before the hunt began. Community members who catalogued all sewer-specific enemy types found that they suggest an environment that had been developing for a long time, with creatures feeding on each other and on the materials flowing through the drainage system. When the blood plague began affecting the surface, its products flowed into the sewer system, and the creatures there were exposed to contaminated materials before most surface residents had any idea what the blood was doing to people. There is an NPC in Yharnam's main area who wears a hat that is unique in the game. No enemy, no friendly NPC, no boss wears this specific hat anywhere else. It is a wide-brimmed style with a specific buckle design on the band. Players who matched this buckle design to other in-game items found that the same buckle appears on a piece of equipment described as belonging to a defunct branch of the Healing Church that operated independently in the city. This NPC is not just a generic street character. Their hat is specific. They belong to, or were affiliated with, a church faction that is otherwise never directly depicted in the game's living characters. The cart that serves as a checkpoint before the Father Gascoigne fight is not an empty prop. Inside the cart there are items that tell a story about who last used it. There is a medical bag, a child's item, and what appears to be a journal, none of which can be picked up. They are just geometry, but they are specific geometry placed deliberately. The combination of a medical bag, a child's possession, and a personal journal in a cart parked outside a graveyard suggests that someone came to this graveyard with urgency, bringing both professional tools and the concerns of a family. The most probable interpretation connects this cart directly to Gascoigne himself. When Gascoigne transforms into his beast form, his coat tears but does not disappear. Shreds of it remain hanging from his transformed body throughout the fight. The specific pieces that remain intact are the ones with pockets. The pocket sections of his coat survive the transformation because they are structurally reinforced in the cloth to hold equipment. Even in complete transformation, the material designed to carry his tools survives. It represents a level of model design specificity that communicates something about the nature of beast transformation in Bloodborne, that the things you carry with you outlast the form that carried them. The bell-ringing women in certain Yharnam locations summon additional enemies when they ring their bells. Players know this mechanically and prioritize killing them. But few players stop to examine the bell's design. It features an engraving that matches the design of bells found in the Nightmare Frontier, a space that exists in a different dimensional layer of the Bloodborne world. The same bell design exists in both the Waking Yharnam and the Nightmare dimension. This suggests the bell is a tool for crossing or connecting those two spaces, and the bell-ringing women are doing something more architecturally significant than simply calling for backup in a fight. There is a section of Yharnam's rooftops, accessible only by a specific traversal sequence, that contains a room no one in the city should have reason to enter. You have to climb garbage chutes and window ledges to reach it. Inside the room, there is a small altar with fresh flowers on it, meaning flowers that have not wilted. Someone has been up here recently and repeatedly. The view from the room looks directly down onto the site of a specific boss fight. Someone has been performing a ritual directly above the location of one of the game's most important encounters, without the game ever mentioning it in dialogue or item text. The street graffiti in Yharnam is largely functional, directing you in the game's layout language. But there is one piece of graffiti in Lower Yharnam that does not serve this function. It is on a wall at eye level and depicts a hand with the fingers spread wide. This gesture appears in church iconography, visible later in the game, in a context that references a specific Great One's method of communication. The citizens of Lower Yharnam were marking this gesture on their walls, either in reverence, warning, or as a response to something they had witnessed. Which of these motivations is correct cannot be determined from the graffiti alone, and the game is deliberately not telling you. The windows of Iosefka's clinic, viewed from the street outside, show light moving behind the frosted glass. This movement is not a static light effect. It is animated to suggest a figure moving behind the glass. The movement is subtle and can be easily dismissed as ambient visual noise on a first playthrough, but on repeat visits at different stages of the game, the movement pattern changes. Earlier in the game, the movement is more regular and measured. Later, after certain story events, the movement becomes erratic. The clinic's exterior window animations are tracking the deterioration of whatever is happening inside before the player is given any other indication. The Healing Church's distribution points for blood ministration are scattered through the streets. These are the tables and stations where the church dispensed its product to the populace. Not all of them are in the same condition. Some are clean, some are destroyed. But one station in particular has been not just destroyed but buried under rubble that appears to have been deliberately piled on it. Someone took the time to specifically bury this ministration point, not burn it or knock it over. Bury it. This suggests a deliberate act of interment, as if the station needed to be put underground rather than simply dismantled. The doors in Yharnam that are barricaded from the inside are often explained away, as residents locking themselves in for safety. But players who examined the barricade constructions found they are not all the same. Some barricades are recent, using furniture and materials clearly grabbed in a hurry. Other barricades are clearly built over a long period, with layers of material suggesting progressive construction. These long-term barricades suggest residents who knew something was coming well before the main hunt night, people who began fortifying their homes against a slow-building threat rather than a sudden one. The Yharnam tomb in the middle of the central Yharnam area is an actual mausoleum structure with interior walls bearing text carved into them that is legible at close range. The text lists names in a format consistent with a burial registry, recording individuals who died in the area prior to the game's events. Some of the names in the registry match names found in item descriptions elsewhere in Bloodborne, connecting the people buried here to the broader lore in ways the game never draws explicit attention to. The mausoleum is a secondary lore document hidden in plain sight in one of the busiest areas of the game. The cleric beast's cry at the start of its fight is one of the most analysed audio events in Bloodborne. The community found that within the cry, slowed and filtered, there are syllables that match the phoneme pattern of a specific phrase associated with healing church texts. The phrase relates to transformation and sacrifice. The cleric beast, in the moment of announcing its violence, is producing a vocal pattern that references the religious text it was presumably taught as a church cleric. The transformation has destroyed the form, but the cry still carries fragments of the language the person once knew. It is one of the most disturbing details in the game's audio design. The path from central Yharnam to the cathedral ward has a midpoint bridge with large statues on either side. These statues are church figures in ceremonial robes. Players comparing these statues to the NPC designs of church higher-ups in the cathedral ward found that the two front statues match the robes of the healing church workshop physicians, while the two back statues match the robes of the choir, the church's upper echelon. The bridge is symbolically staffed by figures representing the two arms of the church's operation. It is a structural metaphor for the path you are physically walking, from the church's medical history toward its more secretive and dangerous upper levels. The descent into Old Yharnam begins with a note placed near the entrance, warning you not to proceed. The note is written in a hand that players have matched, through letter formation comparison, to the handwriting visible on certain items in the hunter's dream. If this is correct, a figure connected to Gehrman's workshop placed this warning note at the entrance to Old Yharnam. This implies that Gehrman, or someone using his communication system, knew what was in Old Yharnam before the player did, and chose to warn rather than inform. The existence of the note without any explanation is a quiet signal that the dream has knowledge it isn't sharing with you. Chapter 3. The Cathedral Ward and the Church's Secrets. The Cathedral Ward is where the healing church's public presence is most concentrated, and it is a space that rewards close examination. The ward is a demonstration of institutional power designed to communicate authority and permanence. But beneath that presentation, the environment contains dozens of details that suggest a very different story about what the church actually was and what it was actually doing. The Grand Cathedral itself, the large locked building at the top of the ward, has a door that remains closed until certain conditions are met. But the door's design, specifically the imagery carved into its frame, tells a story before you ever open it. The carvings on the cathedral door frames depict a sequence of figures arranged from left to right. On the left, the figures appear clearly human. Moving right, the figures become progressively less human and progressively more elongated, with limbs that extend in ways human limbs don't. By the far right edge of the carving, the figures are barely recognizable as having originated from human forms. The church was depicting the process of becoming on its most important architectural feature. The incense used by church servants in the ward leaves a visible, atmospheric haze in certain indoor areas. This haze is a game environment detail, but its colour is not quite right for normal incense. Real incense smoke is grey-white. The church servant incense haze in the cathedral ward has a faint blue-green tinge when examined against a light source. This is the same colour associated with kin-type enemies throughout the game, the more cosmically advanced creatures that represent higher stages of the transcendence process. The The church was burning something in its incense that was derived from, or related to, kin biology, and the atmospheric haze it created was permeating the ward's indoor spaces. The statues throughout the cathedral ward depict figures with heads bowed. This is consistent with a posture of prayer or submission, but players who studied the exact angle of the bowed heads found that they are not angled downward, as a prayer posture would be. They are angled slightly upward, looking at the ground from just below a horizontal gaze. This is the posture of someone looking down at something directly in front of and below them, not a person deep in prayer. Considered in the context of what the church was doing in its underground spaces, the statues may be depicting not reverence but observation. They are looking downward at something beneath the earth. The Healing Church workshop, separate from the main cathedral, is accessible relatively early and contains the full breadth of the church's weapon development program. The placement of this workshop relative to the cathedral is not accidental. The workshop is positioned so that its entrance faces away from the cathedral's main doors. Workers entering the workshop would have their backs to the cathedral as they went to work. This architectural choice separates the violent operational arm of the church from its public devotional face, a spatial expression of the institutional division between the church's pious presentation and its brutal, practical work. There is a body in the cathedral ward area that is dressed in the garb of a choir member, the church's most secretive faction. This is the only choir-dressed corpse visible in the main game outside of the upper cathedral ward. Its position, slumped in a corner of a transitional space between the main ward and the workshop, suggests that a choir member tried to get somewhere and didn't make it. The direction the body faces, the way it fell, suggests it was moving away from the upper cathedral ward, not toward it. A choir member trying to leave the church's upper tier and dying in transit is a detail that raises significant questions about what was happening in the choir's domain. The lamp in the cathedral ward that connects to the main Yharnam street network is positioned at the foot of the grand staircase. This positioning is standard. But the lamp in the cathedral ward that connects to the Healing Church workshop is positioned at a point that, if you trace it on a map, is directly between the workshop and the cathedral's underground entrance. The lamp placements in this area suggest the transportation network was designed to service the church's operational needs, and that the path between the surface institutional space and the underground research area was considered a primary transit route worth anchoring with a fast travel point. The amygdala on the cathedral ward's rooftops are invisible to players at low insight. When they become visible, they are revealed to have been there all along, gripping the building's edges with their long fingers and observing the space below. But what players noticed after the community had time to study them is that the amygdalae are not uniformly distributed around the cathedral building. They cluster specifically on the side of the cathedral that faces the entrance to the grand cathedral building, the most significant church structure in the ward. They are not observing the whole ward, they are watching the cathedral. The pews inside the cathedral ward buildings are not empty. Several contain items placed on them that have clearly been left by congregation members rather than by church officials. There are personal effects, small objects, handwritten notes tucked into the backs of pews. These objects tell stories about the people who attended services here. One collection of pew items in a specific part of the ward includes a child's drawing that depicts the Healing Church's crest above a house with people in the windows. The child who drew this saw the church as a protective institution. The difference between what that child believed and what the church was actually doing is one of the most quietly devastating things in the game. The Grand Cathedral, when you finally enter it for the Vicar Amelia boss fight, is not empty. Before Amelia herself is visible, there are church servant bodies on the floor. These servants are not in combat positions. They are sprawled in ways that suggest they fell suddenly, not that they were struck down in a fight. Whatever happened to them happened quickly and with no warning. The servants were not attacked. They simply stopped. Whether this is the result of a church order, a sudden supernatural event, or evidence of something Amelia did in the moments before the fight begins, cannot be determined from the visual alone. Vicar Amelia's prayer animation before the fight begins is not generic. She is clutching a specific item, a gold pendant, and her hands move across it in a specific pattern as she prays. Players who analysed this animation frame by frame found that the hand movement matches a gesture described in a church prayer text, referenced in certain item descriptions. It is a specific ritual gesture, not a generic prayer motion. Amelia is performing a known church ritual at the moment the player enters. She is not caught in a vulnerable moment of personal prayer. She is mid-ceremony, which changes the meaning of your interruption of her. The gold pendant that Amelia drops upon death, and that you can give to Alfred as part of his questline, is more than it appears. Its description is brief, but the visual design of the pendant, examined closely, shows that its clasp mechanism is unusually sophisticated for a piece of jewellery. Players who studied the design noted it matches the clasp system used on equipment secured to Vicar Amelia's vestments, meaning the pendant was originally a piece of functional equipment converted into personal jewellery, or rather, it was always both simultaneously. It was a tool she wore as jewellery, which is consistent with the Church's habit of aestheticising its operational implements. The Healing Church's physicians, the white-dressed doctors found throughout the ward and its buildings, have a behavioural quirk that players noticed after extended study. When they are not in combat, they move between specific locations in the buildings they occupy. Their patrol routes do not follow the shortest path between 2 points. They take longer routes that pass specific architectural features, certain pillars, certain windows, certain doorways. These specific features have visual markers on them that are too small to see easily, but are visible on enhanced screenshots. The physicians are not just patrolling, they are conducting a ritual circuit through the buildings they occupy. There is a corpse in the Healing Church workshop area that is wearing equipment that doesn't belong to a workshop hunter. It is wearing attire associated with the Otto workshop, a separate faction mentioned in item descriptions as having been a rival to the Healing Church's weapon development program. An Otto workshop member died in the Healing Church workshop. Whether they infiltrated, defected, or were invited and then killed is not specified, but the presence of a rival workshop's personnel dead inside the church's own facility suggests the relationship between these institutions was complicated and sometimes violent. The blood lamps used in the cathedral ward buildings as light fixtures are not just decorative. Players who examined their design found that the blood in them is fresh, meaning the lamp fluid has been recently replenished. The city is mid-catastrophe. Most infrastructure has been abandoned, but someone in the cathedral ward is still maintaining the blood lamp fuel supply. This is either automated, which the game's technology doesn't support, or there is a living person still performing maintenance duties in the ward who never appears as an NPC and is never directly referenced. Someone is keeping the lights on in the Healing Church's buildings. The door to the Pthumerian Descendant boss room, accessible through a specific path in the cathedral ward area, has carvings on its frame that depict the Pthumerian script in its oldest known form. This is distinct from later Pthumerian script variants found deeper in the Chalice dungeons. The presence of the oldest script variant on a doorframe in the cathedral ward's surface architecture suggests that the Healing Church encountered Pthumerian writing early in its engagements with the underground dungeons, and that the cathedral ward itself was built, at least partially, in awareness of, or in response to, that ancient underground civilization. Alfred's questline ends with him killing Queen Annalise of Canehurst and eating her flesh. This is a story conclusion that happens largely off-screen, conveyed through dialogue and an item. But the specific item he leaves at the cathedral ward, the Annalise flesh that can be given to the altar of despair, has a description that references a ceremony in Bloodborne's church lore. The ceremony involves consuming something of a person to absorb their qualities. Alfred was not simply acting in madness when he killed Anneliese. He was performing a church ritual, possibly one taught to him by members of the executioners, the faction he belonged to. The gruesome conclusion of his questline is theologically motivated, not random violence. The cathedral ward contains a set of gargoyle-style figures on its battlements that are not purely decorative. Their positioning suggests they were designed as watchers, but more interesting than their placement is their orientation. Several gargoyles face inward, toward the centre of the ward, rather than outward as protective figures traditionally would. Gargoyles that face inward are watching the inhabitants of the space they guard, not the threats approaching from outside. The healing church's guardians were keeping watch on the people inside the ward, not protecting them from what was outside. There is a specific area of the cathedral ward where the ground is noticeably softer than the surrounding stone surfaces. It is a patch of earth in a corner near one of the ward's side buildings that has been dug up and recovered multiple times based on its soil disturbance pattern. No item is buried here that the player can access. The disturbance is purely visual. Someone has been excavating this patch of earth repeatedly. Considering the cathedral ward's proximity to the underground Thumerian sites and the church's documented interest in what lies below Yharnam, the most likely interpretation is that this is an informal dig site, someone in the ward trying to reach the dungeons by hand rather than through the ritual chalice access. The boss music for Vicar Amelia contains a choral element that players have been able to separate from the orchestral backing. When isolated, the choral voices are performing a piece that resembles a healing church liturgical composition referenced in item descriptions as the church's founding hymn. Vicar Amelia's boss fight music is the church's founding hymn adapted into a combat composition. You are fighting the head of the church to the music of its birth. The original composition, described as hopeful and expansive in the item text, is being rendered in the fight's musical context as something desperate and disintegrating. The abandoned old workshop, hidden in the cathedral ward and accessible through a specific jump, represents the original founding space of the workshop before it was incorporated into the church. The fact that it still exists at all is unusual. Buildings that become redundant are generally repurposed or demolished. The abandoned old workshop was sealed and left intact. Players who examined it after the community identified its connection to the Hunter's Dream found that the layout is nearly identical to the Dream's workshop, which suggests the Dream was modelled after this real physical space. Gehrman recreated the workshop he knew inside the nightmare space he was forced to inhabit, preserving its form in the only way still available to him. The plain doll found sitting in the abandoned old workshop is identical in design to the doll in the Hunter's Dream, but is in a different state. She is inert, an object rather than a presence. This distinction is important because it confirms that the Dream doll is not simply a well-preserved version of the workshop doll. Something has been done to the Dream doll to give her a form of animation or consciousness that the physical doll sitting in the abandoned workshop lacks. The source of that difference is the question the discovery raises, and the answer most consistent with the broader lore suggests the moon presence was involved in the animation process. The messengers in the cathedral ward area, the small kin-like creatures that appear after sufficient insight, are not simply ambient creatures. Players who observed their movement patterns found that the messengers in the ward move in circuits that mirror the circuits performed by the church physicians described earlier. They move along the same routes. The church physicians and the cosmic messengers are performing the same ritual pattern in the same space. Whether this is because the physicians learned their circuit from the messengers or because the messengers are mimicking the physicians cannot be determined, but the parallel is documented and deliberate. The fire that destroyed Old Yharnam was ordered by the healing church, and its aftermath is visible from certain high points in the cathedral ward. The scorched roof lines of old Yharnam are visible below and to the side of the ward's elevated position. The church chose to build in a position that has a clear line of sight to the city it destroyed. This could be pure coincidence of geography. It could also be a deliberate choice by the church to build in a position of visible authority over the destruction it caused, in the same way that rulers historically built castles on high ground, overlooking the lands they controlled. The celestial emissary boss fought in the upper cathedral ward but accessible through a path that begins in the lower ward, has an appearance that connects it to the messengers found throughout the game. Its body type, colouring, and the way it moves are all consistent with an enlarged messenger. Some community members have proposed that the celestial emissary is what a messenger eventually becomes, if given enough time and enough exposure to the church's experiments. The implication is that the benign, childlike messenger creatures the player uses for shopping and gift delivery are on a development path towards something considerably less benign if the church's works with them continues. The back area of the cathedral ward, behind the main buildings, and often skipped by players moving toward the next area, contains a series of statues that are distinct from those in the main ward. The main ward's statues are of religious figures. These statues are of hunters. They are in combat poses, weapons drawn, but their faces are not fierce. The stone faces are in expressions of exhaustion, not aggression. A wall of tired hunters, memorialized in stone in a place most players never stop to examine. The church built monuments to the hunters it used up and put them where they would be out of sight. The workshop hunter equipment in the cathedral ward area, worn by the workshop hunters you fight, has seen modifications that are not present in the base hunter designs available to the player. The workshop enemy's equipment has additions, small tools and devices attached to their belts and straps that are not available as player equipment. Players who attempted to identify these tools found that the designs match descriptions in item texts of experimental equipment developed by the church's research division that was never fully deployed. The enemies you fight in the workshop area are wearing prototype gear that the church tested and then either shelved or deployed exclusively on its own operatives. There is an item in the cathedral ward area that can be found on a corpse in a specific location that, if you read its description carefully, places its origin as predating the founding of the healing church by at least a generation. The item is a medical tool, still functional, still clean. Someone was using pre-church medical techniques in the cathedral building, either because they predated the church or because they had access to pre-church methodology in a context the church permitted or overlooked. Either possibility raises questions about the church's relationship to the medical traditions it claimed to replace when it introduced blood ministration. The painting that appears above the fireplace in one of the cathedral ward's side buildings is not a generic prop. It depicts a coastal landscape with no figures in it. The coastline depicted matches, according to community members who compared it to later game geography. The visual style of the fishing hamlet's coastal environment from the DLC. This is a painting of the fishing hamlet hanging in a healing church building in the cathedral ward, predating the player's visit to that location by the entirety of the game's runtime. The church had representations of the hamlet in its buildings, suggesting knowledge of and connection to the hamlet that the game doesn't otherwise explain until very late. The iron doors in the cathedral ward bear specific symbols stamped into the metal that community members have matched to the brand used by the Otto workshop to mark its products. Multiple iron doors in the healing church's own ward are stamped with a rival institution's mark. Either the church was using Otto workshop metalwork and didn't care about the branding, or the church acquired Otto workshop materials after that institution ceased to operate. The presence of competitor branding in the church's own architectural infrastructure suggests a thorough absorption rather than simply an ongoing relationship, that the Otto workshop's entire material production was folded into the church at some point. The position of Gehrman's old hunter armour, which can be found in a specific part of the cathedral ward before you find it in the main game progression, is not placed randomly. It is positioned in a way that gives the impression of having been placed there deliberately, arranged, not fallen. Someone arranged Gehrman's armour in this location. Given that Yharnam himself cannot leave the dream, someone who knew about the armour and had access to both the dream and the cathedral ward placed it here. The number of characters who fit that description is very small. The cathedral ward contains a garden area separate from the main architectural spaces. This garden appears to have been tended recently, meaning some of the plants show signs of recent pruning rather than full overgrowth. In the middle of a city, in apocalyptic crisis, someone is trimming plants. The garden species are not ornamental, they are medicinal plants. The church was growing its own medical ingredients in this garden, and whatever event began, the current hunt did not cause whoever tends this garden to stop their work. Whether this person is one of the surviving NPCs or an unseen character is unclear, but they are present and active. The connection between the cathedral ward and the nightmare frontier is not just thematic. There are visual elements in the ward, specifically in the flooring patterns of certain interior spaces, that use the same tile design as the nightmare frontier's architectural remnants. The design is obscure enough that most players would not notice it, but community members who had spent time in the nightmare frontier and then returned to the cathedral ward were struck by the match. The implication is that the people who built the cathedral ward had access to, or were influenced by, the architectural principles of the nightmare dimension, possibly through the church's research into what lay beyond human perception. The Healing Church's use of blood extends even to its decorative elements. The red pigment used in the ward's stained glass windows is not a standard pigment. Players examining the colour values of the stained glass found that its specific red does not match any mineral-based red used in historical architecture. It matches the specific spectral properties of the old blood as represented elsewhere in the game's colour palette. The Healing Church coloured its windows with blood-derived pigment. The light coming through those windows into the ward's interior spaces is, in a technical sense, bloodlight. The bells in the cathedral ward tower ring during certain events in the game. Players who tracked the specific bell patterns, the rhythms and intervals of the ringing, found that the patterns are not random or generic. They correspond to specific codes described in item texts related to Healing Church emergency protocols. The bells are communicating. They are announcing events using a coded system the church established before the hunt began. Whether any living person in the ward is receiving and interpreting these communications during the game's events is unclear. The bells may be ringing into an audience that no longer exists. There is a well in the cathedral ward that cannot be interacted with. It has a cover that is bolted down. Players who got their camera below the cover found that the well is not empty. It descends to a visible floor, and on that floor there is something that resembles the top of a stone column. The well is not a water source. It is an access point to something below the ward, something with column architecture consistent with deeper structural layers. The bolted cover was not meant to keep water in. It was meant to keep access out. Something is directly below the cathedral ward that the church considered worth sealing, but not worth removing entirely. The cathedral ward lantern network, when traced on a map, reveals a gap. There is a section of the ward where you would logically expect a lantern to be placed, based on the spacing pattern of the others, but no lantern exists there. Players who went to the location where a lantern should be found debris consistent with a lantern mounting bracket having been removed. A lantern was taken down from this position at some point. The removed lantern location corresponds roughly to the path used to access the abandoned old workshop. The lantern was removed from the path to the old workshop, making that path harder to find and less accessible to anyone who relied on the lantern network for navigation. The large decorative urns in the cathedral ward contain a material that, based on their appearance and the game's broader design language for blood products, suggests they are filled with processed blood. They are positioned at specific points throughout the ward in a way that mirrors the distribution station layout described earlier in this video for Lower Yharnam. The ward had its own blood distribution infrastructure, more formal and architecturally integrated than the street-level stations in Lower Yharnam, but serving the same function. The church didn't just dispense blood in the lower city, it maintained its supply chain all the way to its own institutional centre. The cathedral ward's relationship to the sky above it is architecturally unusual. The cathedral buildings are not oriented toward a traditional compass direction for a medieval European-style church. They are oriented slightly off-axis in a way that corresponds, when traced on a map, to facing toward the location of the nightmare moon that appears in the game's later stages. The church built its most sacred structures oriented toward a space in the sky that only becomes visible much later in the story. The church knew where the nightmare moon was before it became visible, and it built to face that direction. There is a moment in the cathedral ward area where you can hear, faintly, what sounds like a prayer being spoken from inside a sealed building. The building has no accessible entrance and no windows. The voice is male, older, and recites something that, based on the cadence and rhythm, matches the structure of a specific healing church liturgical text referenced in item descriptions. A living person is reciting church liturgy in a sealed building in the cathedral ward during the hunt. He is not distressed. He is not calling for help. He is praying calmly and deliberately in a building no one can enter or exit. The game never explains who he is. The cathedral ward contains an archway that leads to the Forbidden Woods, and its design is deliberately understated compared to the rest of the ward's imposing architecture. This understatement is consistent with the church's approach to the Forbidden Woods, which was a place of significant activity that the church wanted to downplay publicly. The most important path in the ward, in terms of the game's lore significance, leads through the least impressive doorway. The church was applying the same approach to its architecture that it applied to its public communications, making the dangerous things look mundane enough not to attract attention. The red oil lamp style used in certain ward buildings, when examined closely, has a base design that incorporates a symbol only found elsewhere in the deepest layers of the Pthumerian chalice dungeons. It is a symbol associated with the ritual of cleansing used by Pthumerian queens. A lamp design incorporating a Pthumerian ritual symbol appears in the Healing Church's institutional buildings. The church absorbed this symbol into its decorative program, either deliberately as a statement of inherited authority or incidentally as a visual element that survived the transition from a Pthumerian practice to church practice across generations of craftspeople who continued using it without knowing its origin. The Cathedral Ward chapter ends here, but this is only the surface of what the church was building, hiding, and doing in this space. Everything covered in this chapter is a point of entry into a larger story about an institution that presented itself as a healer and operated as something else entirely. The ward's beauty is not incidental. It was designed to obscure, and the Easter eggs buried in it are small windows through that design into what was really there. Chapter 4. Old Yharnam and the Beast Plague. Old Yharnam is the part of the city that the Healing Church burned. It sits below the main game areas in a depression of scorched streets and collapsed buildings populated by beasts and the single surviving hunter who chose to stay. It is one of the most visually specific areas in the game, and the specificity of its destruction communicates an enormous amount about the church's history and methods if you know what to look for. The first thing most players notice about Old Yharnam is the smell. There is no smell mechanic in Bloodborne, but the visual design of Old Yharnam is so committed to communicating a specific sensory environment that it creates the impression of one. The blackened surfaces, the residual flame, the collapsed walls, and the specific debris patterns all combine to create an environment that reads as recently burned rather than long cold. This is a deliberate design choice. Old Yharnam is not ancient history. The fire that destroyed it happened within living memory. Dura, the hunter who stands on the tower above Old Yharnam and fires his gun at you, is not simply a hostile NPC. His dialogue, if you manage to reach him without fighting, reveals a person who chose to stay in Old Yharnam after the church declared it destroyed. He calls the beasts below his friends. Players who examined his equipment found that it includes items associated with the original powder kegs, a hunter faction that existed before the healing church formalized its workshop. Dura represents a lineage of hunters who predated the church and who had a different relationship to the beast-afflicted population than the church's current hunters do. The gun tower that Dura occupies is not church architecture. Its construction style predates the healing church, based on the masonry techniques visible in its walls. Dura did not build his tower. He occupied an existing structure, one that was already standing in Old Yharnam before the church burned it. This pre-church tower surviving the fire and becoming Dura's post is suggestive of the broader pattern in Bloodborne, where pre-church institutions and their physical remnants outlast the church's attempts to erase them. The beasts in Old Yharnam are different from the beasts in Central Yharnam. They are larger and further along in their transformations. The community has interpreted this as representing the additional time Old Yharnam's population has had to transform, since the area was sealed off earlier than the main city. But players who compared the specific transformation characteristics of Old Yharnam beasts to the descriptions in blood-related item texts found that the beasts here match the description of advanced blood beast transformation more precisely than any other enemy in the game. Old Yharnam is not just older, it is also a more extreme expression of the same process. The scorched walls of Old Yharnam contain graffiti that was written before the fire and has survived partially. Enhanced screenshots of these partially burned wall writings show text fragments that include phrases associated with the early blood ministration protests in Yharnam's history. Citizens were writing on walls in protest of the blood treatments before the church decided to burn the district. The fire did not come from nowhere. It came after the church determined that this section of the population had become both too transformed and too resistant to manage through other means. Dura's questline, if you approach it peacefully, results in him giving you the powder keg badge. The dialogue during this interaction contains a specific line where Dura references the night of the fire by its church designation, rather than as simply the night the fire happened. The church had an official name for the burning of Old Yharnam, a formal institutional term for what they did. Dura knows this term because he was present and because the church used official language to describe its actions. The use of the official term by Dura is a small detail that communicates the scope of the church's bureaucratic involvement in what might otherwise read as a panicked decision. The fire damage in Old Yharnam is not uniform. Certain buildings are barely touched while others are completely destroyed. Players who mapped the distribution of fire damage in the area found a pattern. The most heavily damaged structures are those that community mapping identified as having been blood ministration distribution points, the same type of stations described in earlier chapters. The church targeted its own distribution infrastructure when it burned Old Yharnam. It did not simply burn the diseased population. It destroyed the evidence of how it had created the diseased population. There is a specific beast in Old Yharnam that behaves differently from all the others. It does not patrol or roam. It sits in one location and does not initiate combat unless approached. Players who observed it for extended periods found that it performs a repeated gesture with one hand that is not part of any standard enemy animation set. The gesture resembles a human gesture of beckoning, a very human gesture performed by a creature that is otherwise entirely animal in its behaviour. This single instance of human gesture in an otherwise thoroughly transformed beast is one of the most unsettling details in a chapter of the game dedicated to being unsettling. The ladder descent into Old Yharnam from the main game is physically significant. You are going down. You are going into a lower level of the city. The geography of Bloodborne uses elevation deliberately, with the more dangerous and more lore-significant spaces consistently placed lower than the safer surface areas. Old Yharnam is below central Yharnam in a way that is not just spatial, but symbolic. The things the church wants to keep hidden are put underground or below grade. Old Yharnam is the church's oldest secret, and you have to descend to reach it. The crows in Old Yharnam are not the crow people found in central Yharnam. They are actual birds, blackbirds of a type associated with carrion feeding. Players who tracked their behaviour found that the crows in Old Yharnam congregate around certain spots rather than moving randomly. These congregation spots, when mapped, correspond to the locations of beast concentrations. The crows are not random ambient wildlife. They are following the beasts, or rather, they are following the blood that the beasts produce. The crow behaviour in Old Yharnam is functioning as a real-world carrion bird behaviour would, which makes it feel naturalistic in a way that adds to the horror of the space. The blood-drunk hunter, also called the hunter of hunters enemy, type found in Old Yharnam's second section, is a hunter who has consumed too much blood and entered a state of intoxicated violence. This enemy type uses player-available weapons, moves in the style of a player character, and responds to the world with the erratic behaviour of someone deeply impaired. Players who analysed the specific equipment this hunter carries found that it represents a complete hunter kit, meaning this was a fully equipped professional who descended into blood drunkenness, while still armed and active. The transition from functional hunter to blood-drunk predator happened without the person discarding or losing their tools. The powder keg weapon found in Old Yharnam, associated with the hunter faction of the same name, has a design that is cruder than the church's workshop weapons. It is less refined, less elegant, and more functional. This design difference is not just aesthetic. The item description for powder keg weapons consistently uses language emphasizing effectiveness over propriety, suggesting that the powder kegs deliberately developed a style of weapon that the church considered inappropriate or excessive. The crudeness of the design is a political statement embedded in the craftsmanship. The building that contains the Nightmare Lecture building's entry and later content has a visual connection to older Yharnam that players identified through comparative architecture. Certain wall textures in the lecture building use a stone type not found elsewhere in the main game except in Old Yharnam's construction. This stone type connects the Nightmare Dimension's architectural materials to the burned district in a way that suggests Old Yharnam was, at some point, connected to or used in the construction of whatever dimensional architecture eventually became the Nightmare Lecture building. Jura's cannon, the weapon he fires at you from the tower, is not a standard church weapon. Its design matches the powder keg aesthetic, heavy, improvised, and functional in ways the church's weapons are not. The cannon is not a ranged weapon available to the player through normal progression. It is unique to Jura's tower. Players who examined the cannon's placement on the tower found that it is mounted on a permanent fixture rather than a mobile one. Jura built this cannon into the tower's architecture. He has been there long enough to perform construction. He is not camping in someone else's structure. He has made this tower his with real permanence. The children of Old Yharnam are not present in the game's environment, but their former presence is documented by the objects left behind. Players cataloguing the interactable and non-interactable objects in Old Yharnam found a higher concentration of child-sized objects in certain structures relative to the equivalent structures in central Yharnam. Toys, small shoes, low windows that a child could look through, but an adult couldn't. These are the marks of an area that had a significant child population before the fire. The church burned a neighborhood with children in it. The game communicates this entirely through environmental objects and never mentions it in dialogue. There is an area in Old Yharnam that players almost never enter because the path to it is obscured and there is no obvious reward for going there. It is a small courtyard accessible through a collapsed wall section. In the courtyard, there is a fountain that is still running. Water is still flowing in Old Yharnam after the fire, after the abandonment, after everything. The fountain is functional, and the water in it is not clear. It runs with a dark tinge that players have identified as matching the visual properties of the river of blood found in the deepest chalice dungeon levels. Something is feeding this fountain from below. The item loot distribution in Old Yharnam tells a story about what the residents were doing when the fire came. Players who mapped item pickup locations in Old Yharnam found that items cluster in two types of locations. One type is inside buildings, near furniture, consistent with items being packed or prepared. The other type is in streets, far from buildings, consistent with items being dropped in flight. The distribution suggests two populations in Old Yharnam when the fire came: those who were inside and had some warning, and those who were caught in the streets with none. The architecture of Old Yharnam at street level, below the burned and collapsed sections, shows a construction style that is different from the streets above. The lower Old Yharnam street pavers are thicker, laid in a different pattern, and made of a different stone than the upper levels. Players who compared this lower street level to the architectural descriptions in Chalice dungeon item texts found a match. The lowest streets of Old Yharnam are built in the Pthumerian construction style. The church did not just burn a city district, it burned a district that was built on top of a Pthumerian site. The fire may have been intended to prevent access to what was below, not just to manage the beast population above. The beasts in Old Yharnam respond to the bell sound differently from other areas in the game. In most locations, the bell-ringing women summon additional enemies with a ringing that all enemies in earshot respond to. In Old Yharnam, there are no bell-ringing women, but if you bring and use a bell item in Old Yharnam, the beasts in the area do not respond to it. They do not come toward the sound. Players who tested this found that the Old Yharnam beasts seem to not register the bell signal at all. Their lack of response to a signal that every other beast in the game responds to suggests they are operating on a different behavioural framework, possibly because they have been isolated from the rest of the game's beast network long enough to lose that response. Jura's dialogue, when you approach him peacefully for the second time, contains a line where he describes what the beasts looked like before their transformation. He doesn't call them beasts. He uses the personal names of the people he knew before the change. This linguistic choice, using personal names for creatures that everyone else in the game refers to by their monster designation, is the single most humanizing gesture in Old Yharnam. It is a small line of dialogue that takes the entire chapter of this dark, scorched, destroyed area and reframes everything in it as the aftermath of something that happened to people Jura knew by name. The charred hunter garb, available as a set in Old Yharnam, is described as having been developed specifically for combat in burning environments. Its insulation against fire is a functional design feature, but the description of this garb does not attribute its creation to the powder kegs or to any other named faction. Its origin is given as the early healing church hunt, before the church consolidated its workshop program. The healing church developed fire-resistant hunter garb before burning Old Yharnam. The timeline between the garb's development and the fire it was presumably designed for is a sequence that the game documents through item text without drawing attention to its implication. Old Yharnam's boss, the blood-drunk hunter, is a red herring in terms of narrative expectations. Players expect the area boss to be a beast, given the theme of the zone. Instead, the boss is a hunter like the player, using the same weapon systems and movement architecture. This subversion is deliberate. The threat in Old Yharnam is not the beasts. Jura has established that. The threat is the hunters who come to kill the beasts, but end up just as lost. The boss is the warning that the entire chapter has been building toward. The image of what the player could become if the hunt consumes them rather than the other way around. The interior of the building where the blood-drunk hunter boss waits has walls covered in hunting notes. They are written in a frantic hand and reference specific creatures, locations, and hunt strategies. Players who analysed the content of these notes found that they are coherent. This is not the writing of someone who has already lost their mind. The strategies are reasonable, the creature observations are accurate, and the handwriting is controlled. The person who wrote these notes was still a competent hunter when they started. The room shows you the space where a person who was still fine became the thing you're about to fight. The ceiling of Old Yharnam's deeper sections is low compared to the rest of the game's environments. Players who tested this found that certain enemy types that appear in other areas cannot spawn correctly in Old Yharnam's lower sections because they are too tall for the ceiling clearance. This may be pure level design, but it may also be a detail suggesting that the deep sections of Old Yharnam were designed for or occupied by creatures of a specific size before the fire, and that the ceiling height was set accordingly. The beasts that live in Old Yharnam now fit the space. Something about that space was prepared for something like them. There is a hidden path in Old Yharnam that runs along the outside of the main structure and leads to a balcony overlooking a section of the area that is otherwise inaccessible. From this balcony, you can see a section of Old Yharnam that the player never physically enters. The buildings visible from the balcony are more intact than the buildings in the playable area. They show less fire damage. They were either spared in the burning or they were burned less thoroughly. The existence of intact structures in the unplayable section of Old Yharnam suggests that the fire was targeted rather than comprehensive, that certain buildings were deliberately left standing when others were destroyed. The sound design of Old Yharnam at its quietest moments, when no enemies are nearby and no events are triggering, contains a very specific ambient track. This track has been analysed by community members and found to contain a slowed-down version of the main Yharnam Street theme from Central Yharnam, but processed through a filter that removes all the harmonic warmth from it. The resulting sound is the same piece of music, recognisable in its structure, but with all the tonal qualities that make music sound inviting or atmospheric stripped away. It sounds like a dead version of the city above it. Old Yharnam's ambient audio is Central Yharnam's music with the life taken out. The transition from Old Yharnam back to the main game path, the point where you climb up from the burned district and return to the accessible areas of Yharnam, has a specific visual detail. The gap between the old district and the newer construction above is physically visible as a step up in the ground level. The main city was built higher. The original settlement was below. Yharnam grew upward and literally built itself above Old Yharnam rather than demolishing it, and the game makes this geological fact visible in the transition zone between the two areas. There is a dead horse in Old Yharnam's upper section. The horse is not a beast-transformed horse. It is an ordinary dead horse with no supernatural characteristics. It is remarkable because horses are expensive, significant working animals for any pre-industrial city. This horse was not eaten by the beasts or transported out of the district. It died in place and was left. Whatever the circumstances of Old Yharnam's destruction, they included the loss of at least one valuable animal that no one bothered to recover afterward. The presence of a dead, unremarkable, expensive animal that no one claimed is a small detail about the finality of what happened here. The church's official position on Old Yharnam is captured in an item description that refers to it as a cautionary lesson rather than as a tragedy or a crime. The specific institutional framing, cautionary lesson, is the language of an organization that considered the event educational rather than regrettable. The church documented old Yharnam's burning as a lesson to be learned from, which tells you exactly how the church processed what it did, not with guilt, with curriculum design. This framing, preserved in item text, is the clearest statement of the church's institutional character, available in the game's entire text archive. The Pthumerian beasts found in the Chalice dungeons are visually similar to the advanced beasts in Old Yharnam. Players who compared their design characteristics found a degree of overlap that is not present between dungeon beasts and central Yharnam beasts. The advanced transformation state represented by Old Yharnam's population has more in common with the ancient Pthumerian beast forms found underground than with the contemporary beast forms found in the surface city. Old Yharnam's beasts, isolated for longer and exposed to whatever is below the district streets, have been converging toward the ancient form of the transformation rather than the contemporary one. The note found near the entrance to Old Yharnam warning players not to proceed uses a specific verb form in its warning that is grammatically unusual. It is not simply telling you to turn back. The verb form used is a specific conditional construction that implies the warning applies to a specific category of person rather than all people. Community members who passed the grammar concluded that the note is not warning everyone away. It is warning away a specific type of person, most likely hunters, as opposed to civilians or church personnel. The warning is targeted, which means whoever wrote it understood that different types of people would be arriving at this entrance and composed the warning for the most likely to arrive. There is a flower in Old Yharnam that grows in a crack in the scorched pavement. It is not a species represented in the hunter's dream garden or anywhere else in the game's surface environments. Players who identified the flower design found that it matches a species described in the description of a Chalice dungeon material item as growing in proximity to Pthumerian ritual sites. A flower that grows near Pthumerian ritual sites is growing through the scorched pavement of Old Yharnam in a location that community geography suggests is directly above one of the deeper Chalice dungeon levels. The flower is marking the presence of something below. The end of Old Yharnam, viewed from the area's lowest accessible point, shows a depth to the city below that the main game never allows you to reach. The lowest streets are visible but blocked. Further down, you can see what appears to be a sub-basement level of the city, older architecture below the old district. And below that, through a gap in the masonry that your camera can reach on certain angle adjustments, there is darkness. Pure architectural darkness. But in that darkness, if you enhance the image, there is a faint geometric regularity that suggests structure. Whatever is below Old Yharnam extends further down than the Chalice dungeon access points above would suggest. The game is showing you that there is always something deeper, always something older, always something that was there before the thing you think of as the beginning. Chapter 5. Hemwick Charnel Lane, Canehurst and the Forbidden Nobility. Hemwick Charnel Lane is one of the game's most underappreciated areas in terms of lore density. It is short, linear, and positioned as a side path that many players rush through once to get the Rune Workshop tool. But its details point toward a set of practices in Yharnam's history that the main game only obliquely references. The charnel lane itself as a concept refers historically to a path used for moving bodies to burial grounds. The name Hemwick Charnel Lane is therefore not just an ominous title, it is a functional description of what this road was used for. Yharnam had an official body disposal corridor. The scale and formality of this system, a named dedicated road for moving corpses through the city, suggests that the volume of death in Yharnam was significant enough to require infrastructure. This was a city that planned for large-scale mortality before the beast plague made it inevitable. The witch enemies in Hemwick are among the most visually cryptic in the game. They appear as old women in hunched, cloaked forms, and they perform gestures that spawn the madmen enemies around them. The specific gestures they use match hand positions depicted in church-affiliated historical documents, referenced in certain item descriptions as relating to blood manipulation techniques. The witches of Hemwick are not practicing folk magic. They are practicing a degraded or informal version of blood manipulation techniques that originated in, or at least overlap with, the Healing Church's own research program. The Witch of Hemwick boss fight takes place in a room where the floor is covered in a specific pattern of circular markings. These markings are not decorative floor design, they are ritual markings, and their arrangement matches a specific summoning circle design described in item texts related to the School of Mensis. The Witch of Hemwick is practicing Mensis-adjacent ritual work in her private space. Whether she was formerly affiliated with Mensis or developed parallel techniques independently is not determined by the game, but the matching circle design suggests a common origin, somewhere in their shared history. Hemwick's population, the townsfolk enemies who carry axes and chains, are not beast transformed. They are normal humans. In a game full of beast transformations, Hemwick's hostile population is conspicuously human. This is a detail the community has interpreted as suggesting that Hemwick's people chose their violence rather than having it inflicted on them by blood transformation. The witch practices attracted a population that was willing to participate in the activities associated with the charnel lane and with the witch's practices. They are not victims of something done to them. They are participants. The lantern in Hemwick that returns you to the hunter's dream is positioned at an unusual angle relative to the path. Most lanterns in the game face toward the direction of travel, as if to illuminate the path forward. The Hemwick lantern faces backward, toward the origin of the path. This is an aesthetic detail that could be coincidental, but in the context of a game that uses environmental design to communicate, a lantern pointing you back the way you came in an area defined by processing bodies suggests that Hemwick is a place people leave from but do not arrive at willingly. Canehurst Castle is reached by a unique method. You summon a carriole using a summons item, and it arrives at a specific point on the Hemwick Road. The carriage point is not in Yharnam proper. It is outside the city limits, on a road that the main game presents as a dead end until the summons is used. Community members who examined the carriage arrival point found that the road continues beyond the castle drop-off point in a direction that, based on the game's geography, would lead toward the Forbidden Woods from the other side. Canehurst is not just an isolated destination. It sits on a road network that connects to other significant locations, a network that predates the current social order and which the church doesn't control. The aesthetic of Canehurst is deliberately distinct from Yharnam's architecture. Where Yharnam is Gothic and industrial, Canehurst is older, more Baroque, more explicitly aristocratic. The difference is not just stylistic, it represents a different relationship to the history of Yharnam. Canehurst predates the Healing Church and the Blood Ministration program. It is an older institution representing an older power structure, and its visual language communicates that it never accepted the church's authority as legitimate. The architecture is argument. Canehurst says, through its design, that it was here before the church and will be here after. The Vile Bloods, the Canehurst faction that the executioners hunt, have a blood type described in item texts as fundamentally different from the blood used in Yharnam's ministration program. The vile blood is described as impure or corrupted relative to the church's standard, but the description of how it was judged impure is revealing. The church determined it was impure because it did not produce the specific transformation they were seeking. Vile blood is blood that does something other than what the church's blood does. The Canehurst nobles were using blood in a way the church didn't control and couldn't co-opt, which is the actual reason they were designated as enemies. Queen Annalise, the immortal Queen of Cainhurst, is found sitting on a throne in the upper levels of the castle. She cannot be permanently killed. After death, she can be revived at the altar of despair. Her immortality is not explained in simple terms by the game, but item descriptions of Cainhurst's vile blood products reference a quality of perpetuation that points toward the mechanism. The vile blood, as developed by Cainhurst, contains a property that sustains the person, carrying it beyond normal biological limits. Annalise is not immortal because of a spell or a curse. She is immortal because of the specific properties of the blood she carries and has been using for a very long time. The Alfred questline ends at Cainhurst. Alfred kills Annalise and desecrates her body in a ritual the executioners believe will permanently end her line. But the player can revive Annalise using the Celestial Eye item. Alfred's ritual failed. Or rather, the ritual is not permanent against a revival mechanism that the executioners did not know existed. Players who examined the item used to revive Annalise found that its description references a Great One-related intervention in human mortality. Annalise can be revived because something beyond human agency is keeping her alive. The executioner's ritual was performed against an immortality mechanism that operates at a scale their theology didn't account for. The Cainhurst armour sets found throughout the castle are in various states of preservation. Some are well maintained, others are decayed. Players who mapped the distribution of well-maintained versus decayed armour throughout the castle found that the well-maintained sets are concentrated in the public areas of the castle, while the decayed sets are in private spaces. The castle maintains appearances in the areas designed for visitors or formal functions. The private areas have been left to deteriorate. Cainhurst is a great house in the classic sense of that phrase, an institution that invests in presentation at the expense of substance, maintaining the appearance of power, while the actual structures of power decay behind closed doors. The snow that falls in Cainhurst is not natural. The castle is not at a high elevation, and the surrounding area has no snow. The snow falls specifically on the Cainhurst grounds, and nowhere else in the game world. This is consistent with Bloodborne's use of environmental effects to communicate something about a space, rather than simply to represent weather. The snow at Cainhurst may be a temporal anomaly, an indication that the castle exists slightly outside of the normal time stream of the game world. Or it may be a memory effect, the castle preserving a visual state from a period in its history when snow was present and refusing to update to the current season. Either interpretation is consistent with the castle's broader relationship to time and stasis. There is a room in Cainhurst that contains a bed with a figure lying in it. The figure is not a combat enemy. It does not react to the player's presence. It is simply lying in the bed, covered by sheets, in a room that is otherwise undisturbed. Players who got close enough to examine the figure through the camera found that the body is wearing a garment consistent with Cainhurst noble dress. A Cainhurst noble died in their bed, and their room has been left exactly as it was at the moment of death, including the body. Nobody in Cainhurst has moved this body. Nobody has prepared it for burial or removed it to the charnel lane. It has simply been left, perhaps as a testament or a reminder. The Ligarius boss fight, which takes place on Cainhurst's roof, is preceded by the discovery of Ligarius himself. He is kneeling before a specific architectural feature on the roof, a sealed door or gateway that is identical in design to certain sealed passages in the Chalice dungeons. Ligarius has been maintaining a vigil over this sealed passage, apparently for a very long time. His presence on the roof is not a patrol or a guard post. He is in a prayer position. His mission at Cainhurst was to contain something rather than destroy it, and the sealed passage he kneels before is what he was containing. The game never specifies what is behind the seal. Alfred, when he gives you the Radiance rune, delivers a line that suggests he believes his actions at Canehurst were righteous. Players who compared his specific language to the doctrinal texts of the executioners found that he is quoting their doctrine almost exactly. Alfred is not expressing personal conviction, he is reciting institutional doctrine verbatim. The character whose questline gives the impression of personal devotion and individual agency is, at his decisive moment, simply performing the words he was taught. This small detail about the source of Alfred's language at his defining moment raises questions about whether Alfred ever had individual convictions, or whether he was always a vessel for someone else's ideology. The Forsaken Castle, Canehurst Chalice, one of the optional dungeon chalices, contains environments that show what Canehurst looked like before it was a castle. The lower dungeon levels accessible through this chalice have architecture that predates the castle construction by a considerable period. The Canehurst Castle was built on top of an older site, and the older site is now accessible as a dungeon layer below the castle's foundations. Players who explored this dungeon found wall engravings in the older layers that reference a pre-Canehurst ruling family, suggesting that the Vilebloods did not found their power in this location. They inherited it from something that was there before them. The Covenant mechanics in Bloodborne are tied to Canehurst through the Vileblood faction. Joining the Vilebloods puts you in conflict with the Executioner Covenant. Players who reached the maximum rank in the Vileblood Covenant received a specific rune whose description references the Canehurst bloodline's long-term ambitions. The description suggests that the Vilebloods were not simply defending their way of life against the Executioners. They were pursuing an objective, a specific blood-related goal that the Executioners' campaign was preventing them from achieving. The war between the Executioners and the Vilebloods was not just ideological. The Vilebloods had something they were trying to do, and the Executioners were in the way. The path from the Canehurst carriole drop-off to the castle gate passes through a graveyard. The graves in this graveyard are marked with Canehurst crests, not Healing Church crests. The Canehurst aristocracy maintained its own burial rites, separate from the churches. In a city where the Healing Church managed almost every aspect of life and death, Canehurst had its own way of putting people in the ground. This small detail about burial rites is a summary of everything Canehurst represents. It is a place that insisted on governing its own relationship to death, which was always going to bring it into conflict with an institution that defined itself through control over mortality. The Canehurst signet ring, used to access the carriole summons, has a visual design that players compared to rings described in pre-church Yharnam historical texts, accessible through certain item descriptions. The ring predates the church. Someone in Yharnam had this ring before the church existed and either kept it or passed it down through generations to the present game. The continuity of this object through Yharnam's entire institutional history is a physical record of the relationship between the pre-church aristocracy and the post-church institutional order. The ring survived because someone valued what it represented enough to preserve it across the church's entire period of dominance. Chapter 6. The Forbidden Woods and What Hides Below. The Forbidden Woods are the game's most sprawling outdoor environment, a dense and disorienting forest that hides the village connected to the Healing Church's research program into the beast plague and the people it afflicted. The woods are described as forbidden in their very name, and the game delivers on that naming with an area full of dark details that connect the church's surface activities to its underground research. The snake enemies in the Forbidden Woods are the most distinctive enemy type in the game in terms of their visual design. They are not beast-transformed humans. They are not Great Ones spawn. They are humans infested with serpents, people whose bodies have been colonized by snakes that extend from their mouths and wrap around their forms. The item descriptions associated with snake-related materials in the woods reference an experimental blood modification that the Healing Church tested in this isolated population. The snake infestation is the result of a specific church experiment that went wrong or went as planned, depending on your interpretation of the church's goals. The village in the Forbidden Woods is a settlement that the church established or co-opted as a test population. The residents have been subjected to blood treatments, and the results are the enemies you fight through the village area. Players who examined the architecture of the village buildings found that they are not natural forest settlements. They are constructed to a specification that matches healing church outpost designs visible in other areas of the game. The village was built by the church or built to church specifications, which means the population was not discovered there by the church. They were placed there. The large snake enemy variants in the Forbidden Woods, the ones that consist entirely of multiple serpents forming a body, have a behavioral characteristic that is easy to overlook in combat. These composite snake enemies do not attack coordinately. The different snake components attack independently, sometimes creating openings that could be exploited, but also creating conflicts where one component interferes with another's attack. This behavioral dissonance, the lack of coordination between parts of a single entity, is consistent with the game's broader depiction of what happens when living things are combined or modified beyond their natural parameters. The snake assemblage lacks unified intention because it was never a unified thing. The fishing village, accessible through the Forbidden Woods area, reachable by a specific path that most players discover accidentally, contains evidence of a population that had contact with the healing church before the woods were sealed. Items in the fishing village reference blood ministration equipment and church medical supplies. This fishing village, situated on a body of water at the edge of the Forbidden Woods, was one of the earliest sites of the church's blood ministration program outside Yharnam's main city. The church reached into isolated coastal communities and administered its blood product to populations that had little context for evaluating it. The giant plant enemies in the Forbidden Woods, a category of enemy found only in this area, do not appear in any other part of the game. Their presence is not explained by any item description. They are simply there, enormous, hostile plant-based organisms growing in the densest part of the woods. Community members who analysed their design found visual characteristics consistent with the growth patterns described in certain Chalice dungeon materials related to the effects of the old blood on non-human biology. The plants may have grown from blood contamination of the forest soil, the old blood absorbed by the earth and producing an entirely new form of life that the game never officially acknowledges. There is a house in the Forbidden Woods village that contains a locked basement. The basement can be accessed from a side entrance that is easy to miss. Below, you find a chamber with evidence of ritualistic activity, runes drawn on the floor, items arranged in deliberate positions, burned material on a central surface. The house belonged to someone who was practicing school of Mensis-adjacent ritual work in this rural village. The Mensis influence in the woods is not limited to the institutional connection visible in the larger area design. Someone in the village itself was practicing this work privately. The moonlight in the Forbidden Woods is different from the moonlight in Yharnam proper. In the city, the moon provides light, but its presence is filtered by architecture. In the woods, the moon is more directly visible through the forest canopy, and its light produces a ground-level effect not found in the city. The specific silver-blue ground light of the Forbidden Woods under moonlight has been matched by community members to the visual effect associated with the moon presence's influence on a space. The Forbidden Woods are under a more direct influence from the moon or from the thing behind the moon than the city that sits between the woods and the dream. The scarecrow-style figures erected throughout the Forbidden Woods village are doing something that scarecrows don't usually do. Traditional scarecrows face outward from the crops they protect, oriented toward the sky and the birds. The scarecrow figures in the Forbidden Woods village face inward, toward the central village structures. They are watching the village, not protecting crops. These figures may be ritual markers rather than agricultural tools, positioned by the village's more magically oriented residents to observe or contain activity in the central spaces, which is consistent with the ritual chamber found in the village house described in the previous paragraph. The path through the forbidden woods that leads to Bergenwerth is gated by a specific door whose key is found in the village area. The key is on the body of a person who appears to have been fleeing toward the gate when they died, not toward the village. This person was trying to get from the forbidden woods to Bergenwerth, not from Bergenwerth to the woods. They were moving toward the scholarly institution from the experimental village. The direction of travel and the circumstances of death suggest someone trying to report something to the Bergenwerth scholars, or trying to escape the village's deteriorating situation by reaching the institution connected to it. The graves in the Forbidden Woods village are not marked with names. They are marked with numbers. Players who noted this and mapped the numbers against the village's structure found that the numbering system starts in the part of the village closest to the church's outpost architecture and progresses outward. The graves are numbered in the order people died, and the sequence begins at the church's point of maximum influence. The people who died first were the people closest to the church's administered blood supply. The village's death sequence, preserved in grave numbering, is a timeline of the blood treatment program's effects, spreading outward from its source. There are underground passages, accessible from certain trapdoor locations in the Forbidden Woods, that most players never find. These passages connect the village structures to each other without going through the surface paths. The passages are old. Their construction is not consistent with the village's above-ground architecture. They predate the village as currently established. The village was built on top of an existing underground network, either inherited from a previous population or from the same pre-church infrastructure visible throughout Bloodborne. The Healing Church set up its research village over a space that already had a functioning underground transit system. The Forbidden Woods area contains evidence of a previous playable area attempt in the form of walls that appear to have once been accessible through gaps that are now blocked. Players who examined these blocked gaps found that the blockage material is different from the surrounding construction, meaning it was added after the original structure was built. Paths were sealed. The Forbidden Woods was more permeable at some point, with connections between areas that were deliberately blocked off. The current maze-like quality of the woods is partially natural and partially constructed, with certain routes closed to contain or isolate specific sections of the area. The celestial mob enemies found in the upper areas accessible near the Forbidden Woods Bergenwerth path are enemies whose transformation is explicitly more advanced than the snake people or beast-transformed villagers. They are moving toward the kin transformation category, toward a more cosmic form. Their presence along the path to Bergenwerth, rather than in the main village area, is significant. The closer you get to the scholarly institution, the more cosmically advanced the transformed enemies become. Knowledge and proximity to knowledge accelerates the transformation. There is a specific tree in the Forbidden Woods that is distinct from all the others. It is larger, older, and its bark has markings on it that players who found it described as resembling the rune system used in Bloodborne's Covenant system. A runed tree in the Forbidden Woods. No item is attached to it. No event occurs at it. Players who stood near it for extended periods found that the ambient audio shifts slightly in its vicinity, adding a low harmonic not present in the surrounding forest. The tree is marked, altered, or has been in contact with something that left an impression on it. The rune is old. The tree grew around it. The river that runs through part of the Forbidden Woods area has a current direction that, when traced on the environmental map, would eventually lead toward the fishing hamlet coast if the geography were extended. This connects the inland forest water to the coastal water at the game's narrative endpoint in the DLC. The Forbidden Woods and the fishing hamlet share a watershed, Whatever has contaminated the water in one location has a pathway to the other. The connection between the Healing Church's inland experiment site and the coastal village where the Kos incident occurred may have more physical dimensions than the institutional connections the lore describes. Chapter 7: Byrgenwerth and the Origin of the Hunt. Byrgenwerth is one of the most significant spaces in Bloodborne's lore. It is the scholarly institution that began the research program that eventually led to the Healing Church, the Blood Ministration, and everything that followed. By the time the player arrives, it is a ruined building occupied by spider-transformed scholars and watched over by Master Willem in a rocking chair, staring at the lake. Everything about Byrgenwerth is a before and after, a record of a process that began with genuine intellectual curiosity and ended in catastrophe. The architecture of Byrgenwerth is academic in its design. It is a university building, with lecture halls, offices, a library wing, and grounds designed for outdoor study. The academic design is now full of spider-transformed scholars and blood-soaked floors, but the underlying form is still visible. The game is asking you to hold both images simultaneously. This was a place of learning, and it became this. The academic architecture that the horror is superimposed on is not incidental. It is the point. Master Willem, who sits in a rocking chair on the terrace above the lake, is alive but barely communicative. His dialogue is fragmented and cryptic. He uses his hand to point at his eye, referencing the phrase the choir used about opening one's eyes to truth. But the way he points is mechanical, repeated, as if he is no longer choosing to perform the gesture, but is performing it compulsively. Whatever understanding Willem sought through the Byrgenwerth research, he achieved enough of it to break the voluntary control of his actions. He has been exposed to too much truth to perform normal communication anymore. The lake visible from Byrgenwerth's terrace is described in item texts as containing something significant in its depths. The Great One sleeping in the lake, Rom the vacuous spider, maintains a veil that prevents the player from seeing certain aspects of the game world until she is killed. The veil mechanic is one of the most interesting meta-design choices in the game, but what players focused on is the implication of the lake's location. The institution that began the research into Great Ones is positioned directly above the Great One, whose survival depends on that research not going too far. Byrgenwerth is parked on top of the thing it was trying to find. The spider-transformed scholars in Byrgenwerth are not all transformed to the same degree. Players who analysed their models found 3 distinct transformation stages represented in the enemies throughout the building. The most lightly transformed are found at the building's entrance. The most heavily transformed are found in the deeper rooms and the lake shore. The progression from entrance to interior mirrors a timeline, the people closest to the source of the research showing the most advanced transformation. Byrgenwerth is a museum of its own research program, with every room deeper in the building showing you what the previous room's inhabitants eventually became. There is a room in Byrgenwerth that contains a chalkboard that is still legible. The chalkboard shows equations and diagrams that players have analysed extensively. The equations, when decoded, relate to the properties of blood as described in the game's item texts, but rendered in a mathematical notation that the game's scholars presumably used. The diagrams show transformation stages in a visual language that matches the enemy designs throughout the building. This chalkboard is the research program, as it was when someone last worked here, before the transformation overcame the scholars. It is the last academic document of the program, still standing in the room where it was written. The path from Byrgenwerth to the lake, where Rom is fought, passes through a section of grounds where the bodies are positioned in a specific pattern. The bodies are all facing toward the lake. Players who mapped the positions and orientations of all bodies in the Byrgenwerth grounds area found that the orientation toward the lake is consistent across all of them, regardless of where on the grounds each body is located. Even bodies that fell far from the lake path faced toward the water. Whatever killed these scholars, they all fell looking at the lake. Something in the lake commanded their attention at the moment of their death. The Byrgenwerth runes, the blood runes available to players through the Covenant system, are described as having been inscribed onto the scholars themselves, as a method of storing the insights they gained from the research. The physical act of inscribing runes onto the body is referenced in multiple item texts associated with the Byrgenwerth research program. This practice, using the human body as a storage medium for information about Great One contact, is the foundational technique from which both the Church's blood system and the Mensis ritual system developed. Everything that follows in Bloodborne's lore runs through the practice of using biology as a medium for storing cosmic information. The Master Willem's rocking chair, if you examine its position relative to the lakeshore, is not pointing at the lake in the way you might expect a contemplative person to orient themselves. The chair is angled slightly off-axis. Willem is not looking directly at the lake. He is looking at a point above the lake, toward the far shore. Community members who traced the sightline from his chair found that it aligns with a specific feature of the far shore landscape, a rocky formation that, when examined in the game's geometry, has characteristics consistent with a chalice dungeon ritual marker. Willem's final resting position has him eternally focused on a specific underground access point visible from the lakeshore. The keys found in Byrgenwerth are of a different design from keys found elsewhere in the game. Most Bloodborne keys are functional iron objects with minimal decoration. Byrgenwerth keys are decorated with small celestial symbols, stars and circular forms that are consistent with academic iconography in the game's visual language.